Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Helena Rosenblatt, who is a professor at the City University of New York, otherwise known as CUNY, right? And wait, are you, you're in the history department, right?
I'm in the history, political science, and French at the Graduate Center of CUNY.
Wow, okay, so 3 departments, fantastic. Perfect. You're a perfect guest for the podcast.
Be interdisciplinary, yes.
Exactly. And also the author of a couple books. The most recent book is this one called The Lost History of Liberalism from Ancient Rome to the 21st Century, and then a couple other books, one called Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant and the Politics of Religion, along with Thinking with Rousseau, from Machiavelli to Schmidt. Welcome, Helena.
Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you.
Well, this book, I mean, there are a couple different themes in this book, and I really enjoyed it. One of which is that liberalism has sort of, or at least the history of liberalism has been sort of, I don't know, appropriated or hijacked by the Anglo-Americans, right? And so, you know, we at least when we study it in school, we tend to think that this was something that was created by, you know, Locke and, you know, maybe Hobbes to a lesser extent, and has been perfected in the U.S. And so the whole history of Germany and France has been sort of shunted aside. And then the other thing is, I think that what we think of as liberalism is all about rights. And this is also a relatively recent development. And then I guess the third thing is that you're writing a history of a word. I found this kind of interesting, right? Because I think when people normally do intellectual history, they often, I don't know, they decide ahead of time what they think the thing means. And then they go and they look for the sort of genealogy of that. And what you're doing is you're focusing on the word and how the meaning of the word has shifted, right? So, I mean, is this idea of, I don't know, conceptual history or word history, is this kind of like a new genre?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. You brought everything out really, really well. And yes, you know, when I started out, I was actually approached by an editor and said, you know, there's no history of liberalism on the market. The last one was written, I think, in the 30s or 40s, actually, a substantial history of liberalism. There were, you know, as you know, lots of books now attacking liberalism or defending liberalism, decrying its decline, it's over, it's in crisis and all that. But not really any book on the history of liberalism. Since then, there have been a few, so I'm not the only one. But when I started then thinking, what a great topic and project, and I love the great thinkers, by the way. I am unabashedly a admirer of the great thinkers, despite the fact that they're mainly dead white men. I do that kind of history. I love it. I think that they're super interesting and important to think with. So I started, you know, putting together, you know, I figured I'd do a chapter on Locke, a chapter on Smith, a chapter on this one and that one, and then at a certain point, I was like, why, who decided that this was the liberal tradition? Like who decided this? And am I going to include this one or that one? Wollstonecraft, you know. And so then it took me a lot of thinking, and I fell upon Begriffsgeschichte, and I had this wonderful colleague called Mel Richter at the Graduate Center who kept whispering in my ear, conceptual history. And so I started to study on the methodology, and I think I have a little bit of a special take on it, which you mentioned is the word. And I decided then actually, okay, when was the word first used? And what did the people who used the word mean by it? And then I asked the question, did this meaning change over time? And lo and behold, yes, it did. The core meaning, I think the core meaning is what I argue in my book, was still there. But as circumstances change, over time, liberals responded quite pragmatically, I think, to the problems that they saw in the world. And they conceptualized what liberalism stood for. In the course of looking at this question of when did liberalism first become liberalism as a word, I found that it was in reaction to the French Revolution. The word was coined around 1812, actually by critics of liberalism. Isms are
Isn't it? That
often,
always happens, right? You know?
yeah, Calvinism, uh, lots of isms were invented in the 19th century as kind of smear words, insults. And eventually liberals accepted it. But you won't find Madame de Stael or Benjamin Constant, who are important figures in my book, using it themselves at that time. They will use the word liberal, but they won't. But I've found encyclopedias and other people saying liberalism was invented in Madame de Stael's drawing room. And it was Constant and Madame de Stael and their circle of friends who first theorized liberalism. So I kept, throughout my studies and my research, what I did was I used this word as kind of to make me historically true. And it was really hard because you start to slip out of that way of thinking. And we've been so kind of indoctrinated is a strong word, but what you said, thinking that it's an Anglo-Saxon thing, it's all centered on individual rights. And America, it's John Locke, and it goes back to the Magna Carta. I can go even back further. It came to America with the Declaration of Independence.
The Anglo-Saxon, Witten, right?
Yeah, and so that it's a profoundly Anglo-Saxon cluster of ideas, and America comes out as the great defender and proponent of democracy. And as I show in my book, and I think you just said, this is a 20th century idea. That it's an Anglo-American tradition, as also traditions are after the fact inventions and for political purposes. I mean, nobody, Benjamin Constant and Madame de Stael did not say we're the liberal tradition or we're neither did John Locke. He never used the word liberal in the sense that we use it today. He never spoke about liberal. He didn't know he was the founder of, so he didn't think of himself that. That was constructed after the fact by liberals and politicians who need to defend or promote their political view. And Americans, and I believe the British, but mainly the Americans after World War II, even it starts in World War I, actually, want to tell the world and the soldiers what they're fighting for. They're fighting for liberal democracy. They're fighting for liberalism, and Cold War even more so. I don't know if you want to go into that. I get very excited and I go on and on. You can stop me anytime.
Well, I mean, look, the word liberalism is the object of your study, and that is indeed something that was created relatively recently, right, in the French Revolution period. But the word liberal goes back a much longer ways, and and we use the word liberal in a lot of different contexts that are sometimes not obviously connected, right? So when people talk about someone's, liberality, right, they're often talking about their generosity, and that seems kind of odd, right? Why do we have all these meanings? But when we go back to the origins of the term liberal, right, it was referencing not a society and not, a regime, but rather referencing character, right? Referencing individuals. There were liberal people, right? Or a liberal way of life, but there wasn't like a liberal society, right?
No, exactly. So if you go back to Roman times and Latin, the word liberal, the root of the word is liber, right? And it means both, we tend to focus on freedom, but it also meant generosity. So freedom, these were the characters of a noble citizen, noble in the sense of high-minded, civic-minded citizen, who should be freedom-loving and generous, keep the calm, not slavish. They did have slaves at the time, so I talk about that as well. The kind of elitism.
But slavish had sort of a different meaning, right? I mean, didn't mean that you were, in a state of bondage legally. It meant that you were sort of slave to your desires, right? That you were
exactly.
You hadn't yet mastered yourself, right?
Exactly. So it's sort of the opposite of liberal would be selfish. and then materialistic. So that's what they generally meant. So throughout its history, and as you said, it described a human being, a man usually, a citizen. And only gradually over time was this word applied in other ways. So with the advent of Christianity, we started to talk about God's liberality towards him. So there was no liberalism. The noun was liberality, as you mentioned. And then it became Christianized, and it meant then charitable. Yeah. And then eventually in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, it started to mean tolerant and sociable. A gentleman was liberal in that he was open-minded. He was, polite. He was educated. And we should not forget liberal arts education. Right, so very important to liberality, and it's good to think about today when the liberal arts, we think anyway, in the humanities are under siege, if you will, and everybody, and people are lamenting the decline of civic engagement and of citizen qualities of a citizen. That's what the liberal arts education was supposed to teach young boys. Of course, it was designed for young elite, the boys of a certain elite.
Yeah, I mean, there does seem to be a disconnect in the way in which we use the term, right? So when we're referring to liberal arts, we're primarily thinking about character formation. When we talk about, a liberal society, we're talking about, rights and rules and so forth. But I mean, it seems like for most of the history of liberalism, there was a deep concern about character, right, and about ethics. And that, I think we seem to have lost a little bit of that, right, where we focus on, I guess, negative liberty or, de gustibus, right? Like, you can choose whatever lifestyle you want, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
it's not really about that in the current usage.
No, it's almost as if it's means the opposite today, can mean the opposite, permissiveness, loose morals. That's, of course, the critics often of let's say, left-leaning Democrats. They will be seen as, conservatives will generally say that liberal values are loose, are promiscuous values. And that's kind of strange, but I do find also that left-leaning Democrats, the new liberals of the 20th century, have kind of relinquished, are not talking enough, at least, about values and about the qualities of citizenship. And that's not to say that they don't personally believe in it or that they're bad people. It's just that these concepts are not out there enough, not promoted enough. And civic education, if you ask me, is undervalued.
Yeah.
It really
Well, there's
is.
also, I mean, it seems like liberalism, for much of its history, could be defined almost as, anti-Catholic, right? Like there's
Oh, yes.
this huge sort of, I don't know,
Oh,
back and
yes.
forth where on the one hand, it's struggling against religion, particularly in France, right? And then, but there's also folks like Constant who said that you need to have religion, right? And so maybe could you talk a bit about this love-hate relationship with religion that
Absolutely.
liberalism has had?
Absolutely. And, I talk about it more in my second book, Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant, The Politics of Religion. An unusual number of, or proportion of liberals, early liberals, were Protestant, actually. And of course, Enlightenment thinkers in France, progressives, if you will, people, reformers, were upset with the Catholic Church, and you can understand why. Church was a great support of the absolute monarchy. It was in charge of education, which was strongly Catholic, but it was in control of the churches, basically, and also was very much against freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on, which upset, which was a real problem, let's say, more than upset for progressives. And so you have the French Revolution, and it's a complicated story, very fascinating story. But there was a period called the Terror, where there was a giant de-Christianization campaign, and the church got attacked. The church was nationalized, the property was nationalized, and so on. But my group of liberals were anti-Catholic for this reason. But they were not irreligious. They're not atheists. They believe that morals need a religious foundation. To them, the problem with the Catholic Church was what I just said. It's been a support to the absolute monarchy for centuries, and that they call it superstitious. It makes people frightened. It makes people think too much of the afterlife and not enough about this life, of making themselves better people and the world around. I'm now saying what they said, what they believed at the time. And so they were anti-Catholic in the sense that they were anti-church. And I don't want to say that that there were no Catholic liberals, because there were. But they came up against the hierarchy of the church, the governing body of the church, all the time. And if
the Pope,
you look at
right? The Pope there's a bunch of different popes that were, making all these pronouncements against liberals, right?
Well, yeah, and I have some juicy quotes in that book, because it's like with the popes calling liberals, worse than murderers. They're lascivious. They're going to ruin the family. They're, just licentious, horrible people, and denouncing it again and again. I mean, the Catholic Church acceptance of liberalism comes very late in the 19th century. So, and in the French liberals in the 19th century. So I just talked about the early liberals who wanted separation of church and state for the reasons I just mentioned, so that there could not be this great influence on politics of the church, and therefore religious toleration, freedom of speech, and so on. The second generation or the third generation in France are really wanting a very focus on secularizing education, and they are the ones who are promoting. The early liberals were really not able to get separation of church and state, but in 19th finally in 1905, France gets it quite late. So yes, it conflicted. I also discussed things like Freemasonry and other types of quasi-religions that various liberals over time will subscribe to, and kind of humanistic religions that are, again, less about salvation in the afterlife, less about stressing human sinfulness, more about how people have a free will and can improve themselves and their societies. So there are some very interesting religions that are even invented by liberals to try to moralize individuals. So they realize they do feel that morals need a religious foundation of some sort. They're just not pleased with the Catholic Church, and you can kind of understand why until the Catholic Church admits is okay with separation of church and state and religious toleration.
But then you have Bismarck, right, who was, I guess, the grave digger of liberalism. I think that was a description of him. But, and he was very much against the Catholic Church too, right?
Oh yeah, and you had the Kulturkampf. So that I don't think any... well, there were liberals actually who agreed with that, and that gets to one of the things I discuss in my book, and that is that there's always been debates within liberalism. Yeah, so they've argued with there are core principles, some of which I've mentioned right now, but even how you define, like, what do you mean by freedom of religion? What do you, like, how far do you go? Freedom of press. They argue with each other about this, or which value is the most important. And as we know, and other people have talked about, some of these principles are somewhat contradictory. Equality and individual rights. various things are in contradiction with each other. So it matters which one you prioritize. And yeah. Oh, and the big, but the big debate, of course, or the big kind of separation happens over the economy. And we have this today between liberals like in America, like the Democratic Party liberals and libertarians.
The classical
classical liberals.
Yes. Yeah.
And so they say they're the true liberals. And I have friends, good friends who are libertarians and who make, wonderful argument. I think they're wrong, and we debate it. But they say, Adam Smith is the first liberal. We're the authentic liberals. The 20th century American ones have gone down the wrong path. And as you know, another thing that inspired me to write this book was that liberal in America has become a kind of, well, first of all, it's people shy away from the word. It's kind of still an insult to use a politician who's liberal. I'm not sure many of them want to be called that. It seems to be coming back. Do you agree? You seem to not agree.
Maybe, but then, in the 19th century, no one in America even used this term, right? Like, so there were liberal parties in every European country, but we never had a liberal party, right?
No, you had the liberal Republicans pretty late in the 19th century. There was a party, but it wasn't very, took off really in a big way. But today, let's say, I think people shy away from that. Do you remember Reagan and the dreaded L word? He called it the dreaded L word in 1988, I think.
You have to remember, I live in Berkeley. So,
right.
People don't shy away from identifying as liberal here.
No? Oh, good. Oh, fine. I think they should proudly just explain what they mean by it. That's all.
Yeah.
Be true to your principles.
Well, I want to get to sort of modern America and Lippmann and so forth, but before we do that, I want to go back to Constant and de Stael, right? Because those are figures that we typically don't encounter. I mean, I was telling you before the recording that I took a class on the history of liberalism when I was in graduate school. And yes, we started with Machiavelli and then went to, Locke and Hobbes and so forth. And, we didn't look at Jean-Baptiste Say, we didn't look at, Guizot, we didn't look at Constant. I mean, we didn't look at any of those French people, and we didn't look at the German people either, right? And so maybe tell us a bit about de Stael and Constant and what their significance is.
Well, yes. As I said earlier, the word liberalism was really invented or coined around 1812. So right when they were at their high point of activity and influence. And what they meant by then, what being liberal meant then, besides still having that meaning of being a generous, freedom-loving person, Constant was one of the first to use it really as a liberal party. And what did the Liberal Party stand for in late 18th, early 19th century? It was constitutional government, representative constitutional government, the rule of law, civic equality, and a number of rights. And freedom of speech often came before the right to private property, which I find quite interesting. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of, they would call it freedom of the individual, and such things. The government was supposed to safeguard these. So that's really what they stood for in the Madame de Stael and Constant. It took them a while to get there. And I think that really Napoleon also, you spoke about Bismarck, but there have been inadvertent contributors to liberalism that have made liberals kind of, have shocked them into adding to or refining their ideas.
Like concerned about Caesarism, right? So Caesarism is the big bogeyman.
Caesarism is a big bogeyman. Later on, it'll be totalitarianism. But my Constant and Madame de Stael in the book that I'm writing right now were very shocked and disturbed by Napoleon. They, for a short while, believed in Napoleon and supported his coup d'etat in 1799.
Well, so many
Um,
did, right? Like Beethoven, like
oh,
he was the
Goethe.
great liberal hope, right, for a
Hope.
while.
He was going to save the revolution, the principles. He made all the right noises at first, dressed in civilian clothes, came to Paris and met all the people with sort of influence and power. He wouldn't talk to Madame de Stael, which is interesting. But then when he turned into a kind of despot, not a kind of despot, but a despot and a dictator and a warmongerer, the liberals quite quickly, Madame de Stael was one of the first to realize this guy is actually a proto-authoritarian and he's going the bad route. And she started to talk about this and oppose him in her salon, in her drawing room. And and then in all her works, she finds ways of criticizing him. And including her novels, by the way, she found ways, to try to get around censorship, but she wasn't able to. And he censored her. He exiled her repeatedly, but she kept going. And so Napoleon was very important. Caesarism was never. Hey, how about great man obsession? The notion that strongman politics, which we're seeing again today, was something that liberals became very especially concerned with because they saw what could happen when people placed their faith in a strong man who appealed directly. Populism isn't a recent thing. They didn't call it populism then, I don't think so. But this idea that I am the people, I understand the people, your so-called representatives are just, in deadlock. They're just talking. They're just a bunch of lawyers who, this is an very old accusation and that strongmen used in order to get very often elected democratically, but then unravel and destroy all the safeguards that were there or were meant to be there to safeguard individual rights, for example. So they've seen it with Napoleon. Sorry.
But it seemed like 1848, right, created another fear, right, which was that of socialism, right, and the rule by the rabble, and that meant that they had to sometimes, compromise with these despots, right, because they thought maybe the fear of socialism was more important than the fear of despotism, right? I mean, were they kind of caught in a difficult spot, right? Because of 1848.
Yeah, I think that they were really not well prepared, or they should have been, but they weren't able to deal with the threat of socialism, with the attack on socialism for quite some time, and they lost a lot of authority and respect because of that, because they were from the very beginning. Madame de Stael and Benjamin Constant feared the people, the masses. I mentioned briefly elitism. They wanted property requirements for voting. So they were really centrists, if you will, against both the right and the left, if you want to, the extreme left. They're never Democrats. Their democracy is kind of forced on liberals in the 19th century. Yeah. So, and there's another thing I discuss in my book is that we often use these words interchangeably, like democracy and liberal democracy, but they have different histories and only come together in the 19th century. Liberals were anti-democratic, really, in the beginning. They had seen Madame de Stael and I'm going to correct myself here in a minute because history is complicated, but they had seen the masses. First of all, the illiteracy and the poverty of the masses in France was considerable. So they wondered how these people who were often, borderline starving, how they would be able to think about the public good. And secondly, they saw the violence of the French Revolution and reacted viscerally to it. But by the way, democracy as a term was used in different ways. I mean, going way back to antiquity was like the worst form of government, because how can you have the rabble self-governing, right? It's only in the 18th century it starts getting a positive definition. But often it doesn't mean, again, you can find it used in different ways, but often what it means actually is civil equality, civic equality. So when they speak about well of it, that's really what they mean. And
And there was this guy named,
yeah,
what, Montalembert? I never heard of this guy.
right. So I think he was the first to use the term liberal democracy, and this is against Napoleon III. What Napoleon, because there you have the beginning of a plebiscitary rule, and so they want to say that that's not what we're for. Okay, universal male suffrage, we'll accept that, but we need to have liberal safeguards. So this is where we see that liberalism, when it does emerge as an ism, is really invented to contain democracy, to channel it. Yes, we
So it's a
are
modifier. So it's like liberal means, it's a flavor of democracy.
Yes, absolutely. And it's yes, we're for the people, of course, and we're accountable to the people. But it's for the people, it's not by the people, right? With government, we're supposed to be generous, we're supposed to be thinking about them, we're supposed to rule for them, but we can't possibly allow them to rule. So when you have democracy come, then you get like, no, we need liberal democracy, not direct democracy.
Now, was the sort of emergence of public education at this time connected to this, right? If you're going to expand the franchise, then you have to inculcate certain characteristics and virtues into the people, right? And so there's lots of fighting over who had control over education.
Yes, absolutely correct. And, I go into quite a bit in France in particular, this battle to secularize public education. And you can see today how strong that sense is in France, with the controversy over the veil and so on, that it's supposed to be a secular system. Yes, and to inculcate the values of the political system. The feeling is that liberal democracy is fragile. It's not natural. It doesn't happen spontaneously. It needs work, just like you needed liberal arts education way back in Roman times to form citizens. You need it. Liberals have thought that you needed that throughout history to sustain their liberal regime, eventually liberal democracy. I think that it's worth thinking about today. Again, I go back to liberal arts education, civic education. There are people today, many people, who are very cynical about democracy and how uneducated a lot of people are, and how disinterested the electorate is in many ways, how they vote based on personalities and not about a deep understanding of the Constitution and so on. And that's profoundly worrying, I think, and something that should be addressed.
It seems like the stakes were much larger in, say, France and Germany. I mean, if you look at England, yeah, Gladstone was the liberal and Disraeli was the Tory, but I mean, there really wasn't a huge amount of change in policy or anything else, right? When they flip-flopped back and forth. Whereas in France, every time there was a change in the regime, there was like dramatic changes in policy, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And most of the liberals were very admiring of the English system. Now, English Constitution had evolved over time. There hadn't really, now scholars are saying that there were revolutions, but the idea was that it was a pretty gradual change over time, gradually expanded the electorate, gradually became a liberal democracy, whereas France suffered repeated revolutions, and this was perceived as a problem. And it's why, this idea that Anglo-Saxons know how to govern themselves and the world, and they are fitted to govern the world and export their ideas to the rest of the world. Anglo-Saxons know how to govern, whereas the French, they're irrational, they're feminine somehow, and they can't rule themselves. Look at their history, all these revolutions. Even the French themselves would say it about themselves. Madame de Staël said it. They, alas,
Voltaire said it.
Voltaire said it. And admired the English and the English system, even while they were enemies. They still, yeah.
Well, maybe we could talk about how liberalism took on a new meaning, right? So I think this primarily originated in the U.S., right? Walter Lippmann was a big player. You mentioned Richard Ely, right? Founder of the American Economics Association. And
Right.
So he was a big figure in the progressive movement. And so it seems like progressivism was the thing which really led to the emergence of this more modern sense of what liberalism meant.
Yes. So we have this early liberalism that I just talked about, Madame de Staël and Constant, which is really focused on constitutions, getting a constitution in place. And then I explain how in the 19th century, with industrialization, all the problems that they see a lot in England, but also what's going on in Germany with rapid industrialization, they start focusing on the economy, and liberals start to realize, also with the pressure of socialism, that we got to step in. Government has to step in and do some regulation, factory laws, vaccinations, sanitation, this kind of stuff. The government has to get involved. And they start calling this the new liberalism. And this is where libertarians today say the classical liberalism was the right way to go. That was
because Bismarck did all these things, and he was no liberal.
That's right. That's right. They saw what he was doing with a major vaccination program for the army, starting with the army, and then public health and so on. Germans were far ahead about that, and the English then copied them to a certain extent, and the French as well. But it was this new there's this new liberalism that was imported into America by the progressives, and so that's what liberalism came to mean to many people. But I also talk about how somebody like Hoover was very upset by this, the use of the word liberal to mean government regulation, government intervention, and that there was once again, so there's been the split, right, that I just described in England between the new liberalism and what eventually came to be called classical liberalism. But it was the new liberalism that really took off in America. But there was always this discussion, which is the right liberalism, right? And Hoover, at a certain point, just in exasperation says, all right, you can have the word. I don't remember the word. You might have said you raped it of all meaning, or some strong word like that. Like, I have it, because he was just frustrated with these new liberals. So these were the progressives, and then what happens is, with the world wars, and particularly. I'm, of course, going a little quickly here, but you have the world wars and World War II, and especially the rise of totalitarian regimes, fascism, and then Nazism, and then mainly Stalinism and communism, that many American liberals, the Cold War liberals in particular, they're called now, started to rethink what liberalism should be. We can't, there's the slippery slope Friedrich Hayek is a big person there who says liberalism in favoring these government interventionism is on the slippery slope to totalitarianism, and we should go back to the original liberalism, the classical liberalism. And so you have that in America as well. American thinkers, the Cold War liberals, who feel that, well, they feel the need to say, well, we're not that. This is what liberalism really means. Liberalism means individual rights. It means property rights. It's not socialism. It's certainly not communism. And then they say, well, and John Locke is our founder, and look at what he says about property rights. And then look at Adam Smith, what he says about laissez-faire and personal interest. So this is what I describe in my book, and schematically what I think happens. Although there is debate all the way, and that's what historians. I laugh sometimes because I go to conferences and we talk in class sometimes with political theorists, God love them, and philosophers, and they'll say something, they'll explain something, and then the historian will say, well, not so fast, that's not exactly the way it happened. It's more complicated. So we're a little bit spoilers, but history is complicated. But anyway, I think what I just described is correct.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, at the current moment, do Europeans have a very different conception of what liberalism means than Americans?
Yeah. So colloquially, as you know, liberal in America means colloquially big government, welfare state,
But it's, I
regulation.
mean, I think when you say someone's liberal in America, that's what you mean. But then when you say, we're defending liberal democracy or the values of,
Yeah.
the, liberal West, I think that means something different, right? It's a much bigger tent in a way.
True. That's a very good point. You're absolutely right. And there are books now that are, there are groups of people that are being called post-liberals, who I think are not against liberal democracy, but they're attacking liberalism. So that's an interesting thing that could be unpacked as well, because they're, in fact, in my opinion, using all the benefits of liberalism to attack liberalism, all the good things that liberalism has brought us, to kind of turn back and attack it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but is the language of rights, I mean, is it, it seems like it's a tiny subset of the rich vocabulary that one could be using in political discourse. I mean, is it necessarily kind of impoverishing the conversation within liberalism?
I think so. I think absolutely it is. Going back, way back to what liberal meant in Roman times and throughout the whole period. Well, no, there was no discussion of individual rights in Rome, sorry. But over time, starting in the 18th century, particularly, individual rights are discussed and are an important core, become a core meaning of liberalism. But first of all, most of the time, individual rights were there so that people could actually do their duties, so that they didn't have a state telling them what to do, or a church constraining their flourishing, their self-improvement. You mentioned character building. Human beings had this ability to improve themselves. And if you look at what they meant by improve themselves, again, it's not to be selfish and to think just about my, what I'm entitled to or what I want. But it was more about becoming a better human being. And that automatically to them it meant something moral, meant something that considered other people, was social, and including the poor.
Well, it seems like a discussion of character now has really migrated to almost the anti-liberals, right? And liberals are afraid to talk about character and education. And, it seems like the defenders of the liberal arts, I mean, they come from all over, but you'll see a lot of conservatives who seem to be, I mean, not all of them, obviously, but it seems like there's, I don't know, a disproportionate in the academy. There's like 5% of the academy is conservatives, but more than 5% of the defenders of liberal arts, I think in some
I
ways are
know, yeah,
conservatives.
I
Why
know.
is that?
Yeah, I don't know why. Unless something went wrong at some point, maybe all I can say is that I have to give it some thought. It's a very, very interesting question, but I think it's a sad development. I'll give you an example, and this may shock people, but I'm actually Swedish, by the way. I'm the daughter of a diplomat, but all good things came to me from American educational system. I was put in an American international school when my father was with the Swedish embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. And then I was lucky enough to go to university in America, college, and then university. So I love America basically. So when I criticize it, it's from out of kind of sorrow for, and I still love it, but for where it might have gone wrong. And I have asked as a student in this American school in Beirut, Lebanon, I still recall, and I was only 6, 7, and 8 years old, standing in the morning and Pledge of Allegiance with the flag, and
What
my
percentage of the student body was American?
precise, yeah, true. That's another point. I didn't even think of that. But did my parents object, or did I object to that? Do I object now? No, to me, it's a concept. The flag represents something. I'm not pledging allegiance to a man or to a group of men or women, to a concept, and we can debate what that concept is. But the American system, the American Constitution, and all those things. When I ask students today in my class, and I teach graduate students, they say that, oh my God, no, that is coercion. That's coercion. And they tend to be left-leaning, say my students. And I think it's a shame. I just think it's a shame. Patriotism has become something of the right. I know that there are now wonderful institutes of sort of civic education and humanities sprouting up, and they often are I mean, I've been to one wonderful one in Gainesville, Florida recently, which is terrific, and I wish there were more of them. And they're not necessarily spewing right-wing propaganda. They just believe that this is a very good thing to be doing, and I so agree.
And also, I mean, it seems like there are religious people who are now sort of advocating liberal arts education or, great books style education. I mean, is that because, religion has sort of, I don't know, been defanged? It's less of a institutional threat to liberal democracy. It's been domesticated to some degree because you
So
don't
that
typically, yeah.
So that's why they're moving towards the liberal arts education, because instead of teaching religion, they'll teach liberal arts. Is that what you're saying?
No, I guess, I mean, liberalism has long had a very antagonistic relationship with religion, but that doesn't seem to be the case as much anymore. And
No.
I'm wondering, is that in part due to having, I guess, declared victory? Right?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Possibly. Very early on, people who, and Tocqueville and, for example, and other early liberals would say that let religion be free. Stop trying to control it. And Benjamin Constant, Madame de Stael said that, well, stop governments enforcing it, regulating it, supporting it, and it will flourish in a very good way. And yes, religion is needed. But the problem is this collusion of government and forcing it down people's throat. If you leave it be, it will evolve. It will support society. It will follow along society's evolution, which most liberals, by the way, believed was towards betterment. They did have this kind of, we call it now a Whiggish view. They were optimists about the future, and they thought that it was progressively was meant to and would progressively improve over time. I think we've lost a lot of that belief too. People are more cynical and more negative today, but they were optimists at heart. And by the way, one thing, I mentioned how many liberals were Protestants certainly at the beginning and throughout the 19th century. Um, and some of them, this I discuss in my book on Benjamin Constant, actually believed that religious toleration would work in favor of Protestantism because it would allow for a competition, like a free market of religions. And with a free market of religions would eventually purify themselves. They kind of and improve and become less less superstitious, less about ceremonies and sinfulness, and more about these liberal values that they espoused. So there's that side of early liberalism, at least, is this hope that eventually what religion will become is something that today we would call Unitarianism, something similar. So, yes, providence, yes, there's a God, but he's not going to purchase your salvation for you. He's a model. Jesus is a model. He's a teacher. He's not a conduit to salvation. You're not a sinner who needs to be redeemed. You need to be inspired.
Well, look, I mean, I don't think there's been a danger of Caesarism for most of 20th century American history, but a lot of people are now expressing some concern about Caesarism. I mean, is that sort of a potential, I don't know, rallying cry for modern liberals? Can they dip back into that anti-Caesarian heritage, right? And make that sort of put that to the front of liberalism now in the 20th, 21st century?
Well, I'm not great. Historians are not great at punditry or forecasting the future. But I do think that they should, and they are trying to warn. I'm talking now about liberals and Trump phenomenon, but I think the issue is deeper. And the expression, in democracy we get what we deserve. We need to they need to go deeper in terms of what we discussed today, civic education, in particular. But they need to have a so if you're going to attack Caesarism, you're going to talk about the dangers. But I think a lot of people agree that we need a more positive. They need a more positive message and explain what they stand for better. Why is government needed? Why is these rights that they stand for? Why does that matter to us? What is it good for? I was very surprised by the commercialization of everything today. What's happening, the commercial language, and it's all about choice. You had Sophia Rosenfeld on your podcast, and she's got a wonderful book about choice, in the history of choice, which you discussed, and she talks about this in that book. And I recall when they're talking about healthcare and that people, even before when Hillary was working on the whole healthcare issue, they kept advertising it or selling it as a question of choice, and they were not talking about what we might owe other citizens, or why do we want our fellow citizens to have access to health care. Like what kind of people are we if we don't want, there's none of that discussion. It's like, they should have choices. And my other little thing that bothers me is what's happening. This is maybe off topic a little bit, but why is it that when I get on an airplane now, I'm a customer and not a passenger? Have you noticed this? Customers
Always right.
We're customers. I get a consumer
and
satisfaction.
Our students are customers.
They're
right?
customers. And
right?
We're supposed to for a while, we were told, maybe it's still, most of us ignored it, but we're supposed to put the price of the books on our syllabi on there. And when asked why, well, we want educated consumers. It's like, no, that's not what we're here for, in my opinion. The only place where you're not a customer is when you're a guest, and that's in a shop. I know, a very high-end shop, this place, which is called Cinderella in New York. Every time I stand there online and they go, next guest, I'm like, really? I'm a guest? No, this is one time when I really am a customer.
Right. And it's certainly at the university level. I mean, I think, we don't sit around and talk about how we are shaping the character of our students all that much, right? I mean, we're doing it inadvertently. We're just not sort of doing it in a conscious and intentional way. And I think
I
something that has to get back onto the table as something worthy of discussion.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about it at least. Talk with the students instead of me telling them how to be. That's not what I'm suggesting, but we can talk about, but especially at the graduate, but undergraduate too. What does it mean to have a good character? What does citizenship mean? Why do you think Pledge of Allegiance is good or bad? And let's look at the founding fathers in the context of their time, please. Let's do it historically accurately, and let's think about criticism in general, and weigh the good and the bad.
Well, look, I really enjoyed this conceptual history, and I hope you write more of them. Right? Maybe
Thank you.
conservatism can be your next one. Who knows?
Who
But
knows? Who
I
knows?
really enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Helena, for joining me, and hope to talk again soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.